Hi, friends. It's Joe Chadburn. I'm back with Colin McIntyre, the creator of Covenant Cards. Welcome, Colin.
So great to be here, Joe. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, I'm totally enjoying this Matthew 24 fulfilled series and going through Matthew 24, breaking it down verse by verse. And it means so much to me because what people believe as far as eschatology goes really shapes their worldview, and that shapes how they teach their children, whether they believe in a hopeful future, whether they believe that the meek will truly inherit the land, whether they believe that they can pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, whether they believe in a glorious church, world without end throughout all ages, is really important, as well as how it shapes foreign policy with how the Palestinians are treated, how we treat our Arab brothers and sisters, how countries are bombed, and as far as how the environment is treated. There's so much, because if you believe that there's constantly, that there needs to be future and present wars and rumors of wars and all these kind of things, then chances are you're going to be one who perpetuates those things. And that's not good. So that's why this is near and dear to my heart, because it has to do with how we see Father, how we see our God who is love, and how we treat mankind and this wonderful, beautiful earth that God created. And so these are very, very important issues, because if you believe that God is just really angry and wants to destroy everything, and that you're created in his image, then you're going to be an angry person who just wants to ultimately see everything destroyed. And you say, well, there's no hope. Jesus just wants to fry everybody who I don't like in their own fat. And that's kind of, how it ends. So we're in the last days, them not realizing, like we believe, that those last days, end times, that the Bible speaks of, with the last days of Old Covenant Israel, of Old Covenant Jerusalem, of the temple, of the Levitical priesthood, of those Old Covenant sacrifices and ordinances and elements. And thank the Lord, those things have been done away, but there's something much better that has been ushered in. And so God's heaven and earth project, we don't believe, has ever stopped. So young people, don't be afraid of your future, okay? God has wonderful things in store, and we're going to be talking a lot. We're going to be dedicating some episodes, I believe, in the future to those things specifically, and pointing to scriptures that give you such hope for the future and the present, which is so important. Yeah. And for those who are watching via YouTube or the JesusConversation.org, this is part 4 of our Matthew 24 Fulfilled series, which is included in a larger project called Debunking Last Days Hysteria. And that project can be heard in its entirety on the Love Reimagined podcast. So we've already covered a lot of territory, from Matthew 24:1 all the way through verse 15, but we want to backtrack just a little bit. Colin's going to share a little bit about verse 15. I'm going to read that again, let him pick up where we left off, and then we'll proceed into 16. So, verse 15, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso reads, let him understand. Okay.
And so, yeah, last time talking about that abomination of the desolation, there's one other aspect that it would be criminal, I think, for us not to point out. And that is the relationship that Matthew's gospel has with Luke's. Now, Luke starts out very similarly to Matthew, and the two accounts of that, what people call the Olivet Discourse, the Mount of Olives prophecy that Jesus makes, they kind of crisscross and interweave with each other. And I believe in just a normal, casual reading of it, it's not difficult to see how similar they are and that they are talking about the same thing. So what I'd like to do is just quickly read Luke's account all the way up until the abomination of desolation. And I'd like you, the listener or the viewer, to just identify by yourself, what those things are that sound familiar to you from Matthew 24 and everything we've talked about so far. I think this will be good. Starting in verse 5 of Luke chapter 21. As certain persons spoke about the temple, that it had been made lovely with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, Jesus, as for these things you gaze upon, the days will come in which there will be left no stone upon a stone that will not be overthrown. And by they, it's the disciples here, they questioned him, saying, Teacher, when will these things be then? And what will be the sign when these things are about to happen? And Jesus said, be wary, so that you might not be led away, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time has drawn near. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and upheavals, don't be terrified, for it's necessary that these things happen first, but the end will not come immediately. Then he said to them, nation will be raised against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places pestilences and famines, terrible portents and great signs in the sky. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, handing you over to the synagogues and prisons, led away to kings and governors for my name's sake. It will result in you offering testimony. Therefore, put it into your hearts not to rehearse your defense in advance, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom. I love that. Which none of those prosecuting you will be able to oppose or contradict. And ye will be handed over even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you'll be hated by all because of my name. And by no means shall a hair of your head perish. By your endurance you will gain your souls. Now here's the point. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by arms and encampments, then know that her desolation has drawn near. So right away you can see many of the things we talked about in previous episodes. But here, curiously, Luke takes Matthew's wording where it says the abomination of desolation. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, he replaces it with when you see Jerusalem surrounded by arms and encampments.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sounds very much like what we talked about in the previous episode of the Roman legions surrounding the city of Jerusalem. There were 3 that surrounded the city proper. One of them was perched on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city. And you can see how that might fit there.
Sure. And on that, I do like the way the King James reads on that too. It says, when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So same thing, but I think that makes it really clear that we're seeing that they saw, and they did see, the city surrounded by Roman soldiers, by armies, and really fierce armies at that. So absolutely good stuff. So, and if you haven't listened to the previous podcasts and videos in this series, please go back and watch them, listen to them. I just really appreciate everything that Colin is bringing to the table here. So we're on verse 16. Then let them which are in Judea, specific geographical location, okay, flee into the mountains. What say you?
So this is another case where Luke's gospel and Matthew's are exactly, synoptic. They say the same thing. Then let those in Judea flee into the mountains. Let those inside her walls go out and away. And let those in the countryside not enter her. So the fleeing part is the same for both, but the verses following that are slightly different.
Mhm.
But this is entering now a point in Jesus' prophecy that we want to call the prescription. So far, we've had birth pangs. We've had, the sign of his coming was the first one. Then we have birth pangs. Last week was the abomination of the desolation, which was the turning point, you might say, the hinge upon when it's time now to take action. So that's this week's, is we're going to start to talk about the actions, the steps, the prescriptions that Jesus has to give to his beloved followers, his hearers, those who are really listening to what he's saying. Because as he said in Luke, this is necessary for the endurance of your souls. You know, you're going to gain your lives. You're going to be saved. You're going to be rescued if you pay attention to these words. And so, you know, during invasions, people usually, the logical thing to do is in an invasion is to crowd into your walled city for protection, right? So me and my wife, we just finished watching this Netflix show called Troy, Fall of a City. Have you seen that one, Joe?
I've not, no.
Check it out. It's really interesting. If like other history buffs are going to back me up on this, it's a pretty fascinating, epic kind of story. And in that, as we know, the legend of Troy, when the Greeks invaded and were encamped there on the shore, all of Troy just, bunkered up and fortified the city, set reinforcements on the walls. And so what Jesus warns here is against that measure, against that tried and true battle tactic. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
What you should do in a siege is, fortify up and defend the honor of your city or whatever, right? Like that, right?
Mhm.
But here he warns against staying put.
And that's very interesting from a military strategic standpoint, is that you
Right.
would go to the fortified city. From, a chronological standpoint and a theological standpoint, as far as the Jews were concerned, this would have been so counterintuitive because it was the
Yeah.
time of the Passover. So they would have been coming up to Jerusalem. They'd have been coming up to the feast. So to flee the city, for several reasons would have been counterintuitive, at this time. Their
Exactly.
instinct would have been to run into the city for several reasons. Those two, I think, being the foremost reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the reasons are plenty. For example, it was the biggest stronghold in the entire region by far. Herod the Great and his sons had fortified it and improved its its architecture and so on. So it was a very, very formidable city just from that military standpoint. But probably the more overarching feeling among the Jews was its cultural significance to them and its religious significance to them.
Mhm.
This was not just Jerusalem, it was the holy city, man, David's city. It had all this history around it from Solomon and so on. And although it had been desolated before, the Babylonians and the Greeks and so on, it still had that how do you say, this is our place, this is the chosen city, this is the place that Yahweh favors, and they were intent on currying Yahweh's favor. And I wouldn't be surprised if many Jews saw staying in Jerusalem was the best way to make God happy. You can easily see how that would have been a temptation.
Where the temple was supposed to be, although the Shekinah glory wasn't in the second temple, or we don't have any record of that. But that was the place where they believed heaven and earth met. You had heaven, earth, and the sea met there, So this is the place where God dwells. This had tremendous significance, I think, religiously, politically, on so many levels, as far as their culture, their heritage, their genealogical records. I mean, their very identity was so wrapped up in, this one city.
Remember also, we might as well mention economically, because it was a trading hub for a lot of the Middle East. And even though it was not a port city, it was close enough to the shore that it was considered a major a place where merchants, even seagoing merchants, love to deliver their merchandise. Not to mention that you have to remember, with the diaspora, with the exiled Jews, they're constantly feeding in offerings and tithes and all kinds of animals and currency and everything like that into the city. So you can imagine the stores they had were not small. I mean, it would have been very, very well set up for even drawn out siege. But here's the problem. At that point, it was, I mean, later on in the war, it was so swelled up with refugees from Galilee. And now these, remember we talked about the Idumeans now coming up from the south, and everybody's now congregating there. And it's just devolving now into chaos. And as we know, those factions didn't see eye to eye. They burned each other's grain stores, and the rest is history. So, but that said, Jerusalem is in the Judean hill country. So when it says flee into the mountains, that's not something that would have been far away, like across the desert or anything like that. It was just, it's right among the hills. So there's plenty of hiding spots, you might say, or places to flee. If you don't wait too long, when the Romans, if you remember, the Romans cut down forests for 1 mile in every direction, not only to make it harder for people to escape, but to construct their siege weapons, construct their crosses where they were crucifying people by the hundreds, every day. And they basically deforested, that whole area to make it harder. So, there's definitely a window of opportunity for people. If you're going to flee, you got to take advantage of when Jesus says to do it here, because it's not forever. David, you guys remember in history, David and his supporters, they evaded Saul's pursuing army in this way. The Maccabees even launched their guerrilla warfare against invaders by utilizing the terrain. And then Jesus' own followers, of course, remembering his prophecy, and they were instructed by their own Christian prophets. They were intent on fleeing the city before it was too late. So you can see that must have been in their minds for decades after Jesus' ascension.
Yeah. So you and I believe that this has been fulfilled. So historically, where did they flee?
Right. So now this is something I found quite a number of years ago. I was reading Eusebius, and he wrote this amazing volume, which I think everybody should check out. It's called History of the Church. And, you might think, history books, so boring. But I tell you what, each chapter in this book is just tiny, like a bite-sized thing. And if you just read one day or whatever, you'll come away with a really good overall impression of what life was like after the book of Acts. Have you ever wondered, what is the period like after Acts was over? What was the church doing? What were they thinking about? What events happened? What were the different disciples up to, and all that kind of stuff?
In much of Protestantism, that doesn't matter, because it's like everything from the book of Acts until Martin Luther doesn't matter. And then all of a sudden, God started from scratch, and Luther and Calvin were perfect, and we just follow what they say, and that's not true.
Right, which is deeply unfair for those, our ancient brothers and sisters back then. And so here's one passage from that book that I wanted to read out, and it talks about what the Christians did in response to Jesus' prophecy to flee. And see if you can catch it in this passage. He writes, so Aquila, now there's that name again. This is now another guy named Aquila, who was an envoy of Hadrian, the emperor, while he was in Jerusalem, also saw the disciples of the apostles. So this is a few generations removed now. And those disciples of the apostles were flourishing in the faith and working great signs. Hallelujah. Healings and other miracles. For they were such as had come back from the city of Pella to Jerusalem, and were living there and teaching. For when the city was about to be taken, that is Jerusalem, and destroyed by the Romans, it was revealed in advance to all the disciples by an angel of God that they should remove from the city as it was going to be completely destroyed. They sojourned as immigrants in Pella, the city above mentioned, in Transjordania. I guess that's what we would call the country of Jordan nowadays, in that area. He continues, and this city is said to be of the Decapolis, which was a province in the Roman Empire. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, when they had returned to Jerusalem, as I have said, they wrought great signs, as I have already said. And he kind of cuts it off there. But so fascinating to me, finding this little tidbit of history, that eventually those Christians who had run away and fled and emigrated out of the city eventually came back and just continued Jesus' work, like continued being Jesus to people.
Yes.
And I love how they were working miracles, especially in healing and just doing everything that Jesus had told them to do, making disciples of all nations and baptizing and stuff. They didn't curse Jerusalem. They didn't see it as a place that, it's just going to be a haunt of owls and jackals and Christians should never put their feet there again.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they just, let's let bygones be bygones and let's rebuild and invest again, which is what we should do also.
Praise the Lord. Well, very good. Yeah, moving along from there. So we know historically that they went to this mountain city of Pella, fulfilling this scripture and following Jesus, not only his admonition, but his explicit instruction. So that I find that to be very, very a very powerful thing. Yeah. So moving on, I want to just cover something there that I think is important during this period of time. When I look at the book of Acts, and this is kind of just one of those nerdy theological tidbits that I want to add in, okay? So when you read in like Acts 2, verse 45 through 47, I'll read that.
Okay.
And they sold their possessions and goods and parted them to all men, as every man had need. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. The New American Standard says those who were being saved, those who were being sozoed, made whole, and delivered. Delivered from what? Delivered from wrong mindsets, delivered from sin, delivered from, from a lot of those things. But I believe that what's incorporated in that is they were, when they heard the apostles' message, they were being delivered from the destruction of Jerusalem along with all of that. If we really look at that in context, I don't believe that that's a stretch. And they sold their possessions and their goods. And it looks like you had this more of a, communal living type of a thing and sharing. And this does not mean that the Bible is promoting communal living or communism in perpetuity for Christians or for anybody for generations to come. But knowing that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed and the area around there, you would be a numbskull not to sell everything that you had, okay, and to get the money and to help people out so that this community of believers could escape and have goods and have things to be able to be established as they moved along. So
right,
that's the reasoning in that, okay? No one, as far as I know, is, set to destroy Goshen, Indiana. So I don't need to sell anything that I have, and I'm not encouraging people that live around me to do that. Although to be unselfish and to love one another, to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ is important. But the idea of selling everything, throwing it into one pot and starting this commune is really not an overarching biblical principle. It's something that they did then because they would have to flee Jerusalem to go to Pella. And you'll find that another parallel verse there that shows that. Not so much parallel, but something that also substantiates it and says quite the same thing. You'll find that in Acts 4:32 through 35, if you look there. So I just wanted to bring up that point because I think it is important and it helps to put things into context. The apostles, they went to the temple, they broke bread from house to house. I believe the ministry in the temple was so much. They already knew that they were the temple and that Jesus was the ultimate, the consummate fulfillment of the temple. Yet I believe that they were telling people they were telling them about Jesus and that he is king and Caesar is not, but they were also showing them how to be saved from the wrath to come, to be saved from what was going to happen in Jerusalem in AD 70. And showing them how to get out of that. So when you read the book of Acts, we have to read it in light of what we're bringing up from Matthew 24, and it makes it that much more powerful. And then you understand better why this is so when you begin to look at it through this particular lens. I believe it brings a lot more clarity, and you're like, this is why they did that. Okay. Yeah.
And not to mention, the same reasoning holds true for why Paul gave his prescription about marriage. Remember, he says that it's not a good time to get married, in so many words. And the idea there is that shouldn't be a law for all Christians. And in fact, that shouldn't cause certain denominations to say that priests should never get married or anything, or celibacy is somehow holier, or getting married is less holy. But the idea is just, look, in this crucible of persecution everybody's in right now, you're kind of risking family members if you get married, and it might not, they can use your wife as bait or use it as leverage against you and your kids and so on. So plus, Jesus talks about people's parents turning and kids turning on each other and all that kind of stuff. It's just wise to have these family ties right now, but that doesn't mean, like he said, in perpetuity. That's not for us.
Yeah. So he's telling when you see the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem, you're going to know it's time to flee to the mountains. And then verse 17, let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Get out of there. And again, it's going to be counterintuitive because they should be there in their minds for the Passover. Those who did not understand that Jesus was the consummate fulfillment of the Passover and every other feast, they would have been there, and people would have been going up to Jerusalem at that time. So, okay, so let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Verse 18, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. You got anything to share on that one?
Yeah. So, if this was supposed to be a modern day fulfillment, then you might think, well, what are people doing on their housetop? Are they fixing their shingles maybe? Or, is it, especially if you're talking about the West, where we have a completely different kind of architecture to what they had in the Middle East or still do in the Middle East and in India, so on. But if you just look at the culture of the time and the way that houses were and the social customs that people had, even this is also a good point, a good place where the Bible can interpret itself. So in Acts chapter 10, verse 9, it talks a little bit about what people did on housetops back then, And if you remember, Peter ascended around the 6th hour up to his roof to do what? Well, it was to pray. And he became hungry and wished to taste some food. They were preparing it. And as they were preparing it, an ecstasy came upon him. And then he saw that vision of the sky opening up and an object descending like this great sheet let down to the ground by 4 corners. And that was a pivotal moment in Christian history when the Jewish Christians realized that the things that were unclean before are no longer unclean. And so just from that little tidbit there, you can see that people would have been in the time Jesus was talking about, praying up there on the roof. They would have been eating food probably up there, because especially in because towards the evening time, it was cooler outside of your house than inside of your house. And
The
and
main
then
statement that was being made there was there are no people who are unclean. He was using, animals
yeah,
and all that type thing as an object lesson, Yeah.
right, exactly. And so that also made me or reminded me of Matthew 10, verse 27, where Jesus talks about housetops. He says, "Look, what I say to you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. And don't fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul."
Mhm.
So I was thinking maybe this is another thing people were doing on housetops. Perhaps the Christians were preaching,
Mhm.
prophesying. They were telling people because Jesus had already ascended. And so now they were taking it upon themselves to proclaim upon the roofs of their houses the
Yeah.
same thing that Jesus proclaimed in chapters like Matthew 24 and Luke 21. So I,
Yeah.
I, I see that would be the most responsible thing for Christians to do during that time if they were really loved their neighbor, you might say,
Yeah.
and help.
Christians and Muslims still do that today, to this day in certain places in the world. So very interesting.
Right. And so this is why, he warns, if you're on the housetop, don't go back to get all your stuff. And this is the great question that you hear a lot. If your house was burning down, what would you go back in? What's the one thing you'd go back in and take? And for
Hmm.
some people, it's like their photo album, it's their dog
Hmm.
or whatever. And but Jesus is like, yeah, you're not going to have time to descend to collect things from your house, and the best thing to do would be to move before it's too late. Yeah.
And I think, from my understanding of history, I don't, because there was such rebellion and all, I don't see where the Romans were all that bloodthirsty if someone wanted to escape. Matter of fact, I think the Jewish rebellion led to more, and I know it led to more bloodshed than there needed to be
Well,
if there were any to begin with. So I'm not so sure, and this is just a theory, but that it would have been, if you're seeing them come and then you're able to get down from your rooftop and leave, it just would have appeared somebody is surrendering, they have no weapons, and I don't know that you couldn't have gotten through, certain lines of offense, maybe.
well, having read War of the Jews, I can tell you that the the treatment that Josephus received from the Roman legions
Hmm.
was a bit exceptional. When it came to deserters and people fleeing and stuff like that, it was a mixed bag. There was some
Yeah.
pretty ruthless legionaries out there, and one of the things that they used to, because remember how greedy they were. What they
Yeah.
used to do is they used to see if there was any gold hidden. Some Jews used to ingest the gold, like eat it,
Hmm.
and then sometimes the legionaries would actually kill them just to get the gold that they had hidden. So these are things that Josephus records. Also, people fleeing to get supplies and kind of restore supply lines.
Yeah.
Armies would be fairly merciless regarding that.
Yeah.
But yeah, to be honest, it was both sides that was pretty ruthless and bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
And unless you're a Josephus, yeah.
Yeah, I just wonder, as far as the window and the gap, and if you're seeing this, happen, and you can't even go down into your house, um, if you're on the housetop, then I would imagine, I'd have to imagine, if Jesus said it, that there had to have been some way of escape or some sort of hope. This would have been
Yeah,
the smartest
right.
thing to do, because this to me seems like some people who are a little bit late to the party. If you're on your housetop when this is happening, you can't even go down to get something. So it's just kind of thinking there.
Yeah. And if I could if you see it from an eagle eye view of the city,
Yeah.
then
Hmm.
you could imagine that the legions rather, would have approached the city from one, maybe two directions, and
Yeah.
then proceed to gradually encircle it. So as
Yeah.
long as you saw just one legion, even off in the distance, beginning to surround your
Yeah.
city, I think there was, ample enough time, especially given the hills around it, you could have
Yeah.
escaped.
To
But
my understanding, if they would have gone the coastal way, then they really would have got clobbered if they wouldn't have followed Jesus' instructions. If they'd have fled and gone toward the path of least resistance, so to speak, the flat land,
Yeah.
they would have been clobbered and slaughtered. Yeah.
Yeah. But like we said, when they started deforesting the hills, then that's the point of, they did a good job of guarding every exit. And the stories are very interesting. The different ruses and deceptions and tricks that the Jews tried to play on the legion, and some of them worked, and some of them definitely didn't work. So yeah,
that's very interesting. But but we know that believers did escape and followed instructions and got where they needed to be. So that's pretty amazing. Yeah. So, okay. Ready for verse 19?
Yes, absolutely.
I think so. Okay. All right. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days.
Yeah. Now, reading Josephus.
Viewer discretion is advised. Send the children to their rooms.
Yes, I won't talk about it for too long, but there is a portion of Josephus there, War of the Jews, where he talks about something that happened as the siege drew on later. And of course, we talked about the grain stores, the food stores were now depleted. Different raiding, parties inside the city are now raiding other parts of the city for any trace of food of any kind. And there was a report, though, that really caused the morale of the entire city to plummet. And this was the low point, I would say, of the siege. This is where people really started to give up hope that God was really going to save them. And that was the story of a woman, apparently an aristocrat of some sort, who was caught eating her own child. And so it was that point of desperation. People could hardly believe their ears when this story started to spread. And that's when people were starting to throw up their hands, like we said, and wonder if all was not really lost and they had been fighting this for no reason.
Yeah.
And so,
some crazy stuff, really is. Yeah. So verse 20, and I have some interesting stuff I've geeked out on this verse, but pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So you want me to just break this down a little bit and then get your take on it?
Yeah, I'm very eager to hear what you got.
Okay. Well, I'm just examining the importance of prayer kind of as a subtopic here. And Jesus telling them to pray that they're not going to have to flee in the winter or on the Sabbath day. And it turns out that they didn't have to. So it appears that prayer worked. And the Lord was just inviting them to cooperate with his plan and to be a catalyst. I know there's a mystery here, but to be a catalyst to cause certain things to happen and to not happen, and then to happen in another season. I look at, now the fall of Jerusalem happened in April 14th of AD 70. It happened in the spring, not the winter. It was 3 days prior to Passover, which, if my sources are correct, also coincided with the Sabbath day. So this was 3 days before that. So it's in the spring, so it's not in the winter, and it's 3 days before the Sabbath day. So it's not on the Sabbath day either. What else is interesting? In the fall of 67 to the winter of 68, the fall of 67 goes into the winter of 67 and the winter months at the beginning of 68. But it says Vespasian decided to delay attacking Jerusalem and let factional fighting weaken the rebels. So I find that very interesting, because here's a winter event a couple years before the destruction, when he's ready to destroy Jerusalem, and then they're turned away. So this, anyone who's watching this, this had to be a precursor. I don't know if there's any history where some of them kind of fled to begin with and then went back, or what happened here. But there's evidently, they're obviously seeing some things happen, you know. So I don't know if I know that this is being delayed. I believe that their prayers have something to do with it, and maybe you know, could just be practice for the main event here a little bit, so they got their eyes open, because this is there is an imminent threat prior to AD 70, and then you've got then you've got go ahead.
No, just one thing to add there is, I don't know if it's the same point of time that you're talking about, but if you remember, there was infighting in Rome over who was going to be the next emperor, right?
Yeah.
So Vespasian leaves the legions there surrounding Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And goes and his soldiers proclaimed him emperor on the battlefield. And that was something that was apparently a prophecy that Josephus kind of helped him to believe, that it was about him, and that the prophecy was that he, at least the way he interpreted it, was that the emperor of the world, the known world, would come from that area, Judea, you know, that area of the world.
Yeah.
And so he left to make his claim, although from what I've read, he wasn't really super interested in becoming the emperor, but that kind of changed his mind, and he went there to pursue his interests, and that, like you said, caused a reprieve, which would have been an excellent time for anybody who is late in obeying Jesus' words to get out.
Yeah, and I mean, that's in part of the timeline I'm going to share. Those are good details there. And then you have Nero assassinated on June 9th of AD 68. And Vespasian, again, was prepared to attack Jerusalem full force before he received word of Nero's death. And then there was a pause. And then in the winter of 68, going into 69, according to Josephus, Vespasian officially suspended the campaign against Jerusalem pending further instructions, and Titus and Agrippa were sent to meet the new emperor Galba. And then in autumn of 69, Vespasian freed Josephus at Titus' recommendation. And there's a tie-in there with the prophecy that you spoke of. And then in the winter of 69, again, this is the winter prior, okay? So that this wouldn't happen in the winter. But the winter of 69, there was civil war in Italy. And so again, the fall of Jerusalem is in April 14th, AD 70. It's not in the winter, and it's not on the Sabbath day. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Collin, do you believe that the church's prayers had anything to do with the timing of the fall of Jerusalem on April 14th, AD 70, when then Emperor Vespasian dispatched Titus to crush the city?
Yeah. Not only the timing of, you know, winter with geopolitical events, but also winter is just a hard time to try to survive out by yourself. This is one of the reasons why scholars agree that Jesus wasn't born at Christmas, because that means that the flocks would have been on the hills by night in the winter. That never happened, you know, in that day, in that culture. And so flocks would have been safely at home in their barns, in their in some kind of building that's, you know, decently insulated. And so, you know, just the survival aspect of it is just really important to pray into. And so prayer, I think here prayer, it's not that begging, pleading God, like, please change your mind about stuff. That's not what he's talking about. No. I like how you put it. It's a catalyst. That is to say, that a human being on earth speaking aloud or speaking into the world, the things of God, the words of God, it has an impact. And it's more than this, you know, positive psychology kind of thing that kind of some people have going on. It taps into, I think, something that's sewn into the fabric of the universe and the covenant that God has made with mankind.
Yeah.
The fact that,
I see it as somewhat of a creative decree.
yeah, like that, yeah.
Yeah.
You can manifest things or call things into being that are not
Mhm.
as though they are. And so just like the way that God created the world, the universe in Genesis chapter 1, we can set about being God's voice, his representatives, his ambassadors in decreeing things on this earth.
Mhm.
And in this case, this is not we don't do it to abuse people. We don't take advantage of certain things. Uh, we do it in order to save lives and to
Mhm.
love people. And I can't think of especially in this chaotic situation, I can't think of a better prayer, a better declaration than, in the name of Jesus. Um, our opportunity is not going to be in the winter or on the Sabbath. And by the way, do you want to mention something about the Sabbath? Like some.
Yeah. What? Yeah. Well, I think I, covered what I would. Yeah. What I was going to. But I mean, of course, on the Sabbath, you could only go a Sabbath day's journey. You couldn't
Yeah,
work. You were pretty much hamstrung. So
yeah,
if you adhered to Jewish tradition and had not seen Jesus as the consummate fulfillment of the Sabbath, you were in between a rock and a hard place.
exactly. Yeah, that there was temple guards apparently is what I've read. Temple guards that would arrest people. And so I remember hearing a funny story one time where a guy was walking in the middle of the road, and he was a very venerable rabbi. I can't remember his name, but he had the long robes that the older men wore.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, on the Sabbath, a bird crawled underneath his cloak. And so, you know, the poor man, because it was the Sabbath, couldn't even reach down and help the bird to escape the folds of his robe. He
Mhm.
just had to kind of sit down there on his haunches until evening, until sundown, when the Sabbath was over. And I'm sure I can just imagine the bird is just under his robes, and then finally he can lift up his skirts and let the bird out.
Yeah.
And so you can see, yeah, because of those things, they were very strict about activities on the Sabbath. So that could be the reason why Jesus says to pray that it's not on that.
Yeah, and they did, and like I said, it didn't fall on the Sabbath and didn't fall in the winter. So I find these things just so intriguing and such a blessing there. You have anything else you want to share there on verse 20?
Other than Christians all over the world, this is part of our mandate. If you're a follower of the way, follower of Jesus, then our privilege, it's our privilege to agree with God about things that are going on in the world today, and not just praying against this person or that person, against this political candidate or whatever.
Mhm.
It's more get heaven's view, get the new covenant view of what God wants to do in the world today, beyond all the distractions. His economy is different than the world's economy. His culture is different than your culture you were born into.
Mhm.
His customs are different. His love is much less conditional than what we've grown up with. And so all of these things we can speak into existence. And I encourage you to follow people, make friends with people that are on that path, on that journey, that are really active in bringing God's miracle working power, his healing power, his spiritual gifts, his declaration of his peacemaking, as you've so well said. And follow those people, get to know them on social media rather than the doom and gloom and the kind of prophets with sackcloth and ashes. Though those kind of people, they don't tend to bring, I think, the thoughts and the attitude that God has necessarily in the world today. Yeah.
Yes, yes. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Beat your swords into plowshares. Yeah.
Oh, I like it. That's
Yes.
awesome, man.
Be peacemakers. Yes, absolutely. So important. Yeah. Um, Something I was thinking, I've never seen a movie about the destruction of Jerusalem and the believers fleeing to Pella.
Right.
Have you? Is there a such thing? If not, someone needs to make that movie.
I was thinking about that. That's amazing that you brought that up. I was just thinking about that a few hours ago. And there was a HBO miniseries called Rome. I don't know if you remember that, Rome. And
I think I may have seen it on, if it went on Prime or Netflix, I may have, because I am a history geek and I've watched,
okay.
several different ones.
It was so fascinating. I really liked watching, although it was, you know, typically brutal as befit that age, that pagan age. But anyways, you know, it went into the family politics of Julius Caesar, rather. And one of the things that it mentioned or depicted actually was Herod the Great's relationship with Augustus Caesar, Octavian, in the show, and how they grew up together, and I think they were mentored by the same tutor or whatnot. And that's why there was such a buddy-buddy relationship that Herod's family had with Rome. Well, as the show progressed, I could tell where the show was going. I believe they were definitely going to portray the Roman invasion of Jerusalem. If the show would have been allowed to continue for 2-3 more seasons, I read that's where they were going to go. But unfortunately, each episode cost millions of dollars. So HBO just canceled it. So I thought, yeah, like you said, it would be so amazing to actually have a depiction of that on TV. But apparently the treatments were being drawn up for that. They had an actor for Herod and all these other people in Jerusalem at the time. Yeah. And they were going to do something like that. The only other movie about that period of time was called Masada. It was not a movie, but a miniseries, I think in the 70s, 80s.
Yeah, I remember that.
I think, was Peter O'Toole in that or something like that? I can't remember who was in that.
I can't remember the actors, but I remember seeing it back in the day.
But that took place like 3 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. And that was the last kind of hurrah for the Zealots. And they actually committed mass suicide, according to some archaeologists or scholars, rather, when the Romans were besieging the fortress of Masada. Yeah. And that was the official end of the War of the Jews, by the way. So,
so that's amazing. That's like, the real Left Behind. If there was a movie, and I've often thought too, just some fiction that's based on what we believe, fiction based on what we believe to be truth about a glorious church and about the earth's restoration and just about all of these things. I think there's definitely a place and a need for that. When you look at all that the damage that the Left Behind stuff did, I'm like, yes, it's time for godly positivity and eternal optimism and hope.
So
of the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men. Yes. So he's our Prince of Peace.
Any budding filmmakers or authors or, playwrights, anything dramatic like that, man, this is your time.
If you're watching this, somebody, forward it to them. Let them know. Talk to them, because this is really important. Well, man, I have just so enjoyed this. We had agreed that this was a good closing point before we talk about the Great Tribulation. That already happened, but let the cat out of the bag a little bit there. Was fulfilled in that generation, is what we believe with all our hearts. You have anything before we close there?
No, I love you too, Joe. Thanks for having me on, and I look forward to many more of these. And let freedom reign. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what a pleasure. And to all of our viewers, listeners, man, we love you so much. Appreciate you. If you have any comments, questions, or input, you may be just an avid scholar and you have something to share that's going to just make what we're saying more vivid, or perhaps correct something that I may have said, not Colin, but correct something I may have said. that would be great. We're always open to learn and to grow and to
Absolutely.
understand. And more of history is being unearthed, more just a greater understanding. And thank the Lord for technology. And you don't have to be stuck with the theology or the understanding, bless them, but of your hometown pastor out in the woods somewhere, in the 1800s. We have now that the world has been made smaller, and all of the theological minds can come together, and everybody can have access to to what's going on in the body of Christ and what people believe from different camps, and then can draw their own conclusions from there. Yeah. So God bless you. We love you so much, and have a great week. We'll be back with you soon.
Bye, everybody.